On a brief trip to Colorado this past year, me and my pals took a detour into Rocky Mountain National Park. We were severely unprepared and assumed that the park would be easily navigable. We were wrong. After driving in circles for multiple hours with no service and no water, we gave up and decided to head home. However, my internal tantrum about not getting to see the ghost towns in the area raged on. Which brings us to this video, where I will painstakingly pore over every bit of research that my amateur researcher heart could find about the Colorado ghost towns. Except it's only the ones that I found interesting. So if you are looking for lame content, boring content, you won't find it here. Because you know what's not lame? 100-year-old dilapidated shacks. Those rock. First things first, what is a ghost town? Well, dictionary.com defines a ghost town as a deserted town with no or very few remaining inhabitants. All 50 of the United States have ghost towns, but California, Colorado, and Texas are home to over half of those due to their mining popularity in the late 19th century. As you may have already gathered, mining is not sustainable. There will come an end to what you can profit on. Pretty rapidly in most of these cases. These 1800s people, though, they were crazy. They were crazy about mining. They would jump into any hole they could find gems in, set up shop, and as soon as they started finding more slag than ore, they were out. At first, it was difficult for me to understand how you could put so much time, effort, and money into a town only to literally abandon everything in it and leave it behind forever, but the more that I researched, the clearer that became. There are a lot of things that could cause someone to want to live in a really small or even uncomfortable town. Things like tradition, farming, beauty, cost of living, quality of life, abundance of resources. So we can pretty much immediately discount tradition or family attachment, given that there were not generations of people living here, and we can also discount quality of life if we're gonna be honest. Farming was often impossible at these high altitudes and low temperatures, so cost of living wasn't truly a factor, as that would go up as everything had to be transported into the town. So we're left with beauty and resources. But once the resources were gone, beauty is just not enough to get people to stay. Probably the best preserved ghost town in the state of Colorado is St. Elmo. Sitting at an elevation of 9,961 feet, the town, originally called Forest City, was founded in 1880. The promise of gold and silver drew miners in, and by 1881, the population was already about 2,000 people. The name Forest City was changed pretty quickly because there were already several towns around with that same name, and the name St. Elmo was chosen by a man named Griffith Evans, who was reading a novel by the same title and literally was like, oh, I'll just make a diss. As you hear about more towns, you'll discover that most of these populations were primarily male, and therefore they prioritized different kinds of businesses. St. Elmo was chock full of saloons, hotels, and dance halls. Most of the people in town worked for the Mary Murphy mine, which brought in about $60 million worth of gold in its time of operation. That's about $946 million worth of gold in today's money, so almost $1 billion of gold. Now, were the miners receiving this money? No, silly. The average gold miner earned anywhere from $8 to $16 a day, which is about $150 to $240 a day. It's not like bad by any means. It's more than I make at like my job. But, you know, is it really worth crawling through the dark for like 12 hours and then dying early of a disease that we're going to discuss later? No. Even while other mines were losing money and shutting down, the Mary Murphy mine continued operation until the 1920s, when the local railroad shut down and then the mine was abandoned. Legend has it that the remaining population of St. Elmo hopped on that last train and never came back. However, this is totes not true, because the post office didn't even shut down until 1952, when the postmaster died. 43 original buildings still stand, including a saloon, a jail, a courthouse, a mercantile, and lots of private homes. The general store even still operates in the summer months. The high quality of the town's preservation is likely due to how easily it can be accessed. Essentially, there's no excuse for it not to be upkept when people visit it all the time and it's a hot tourist destination. While some of these do feel spooky to me, this one is not one of them. I say that although you could not pay me enough money to work in that general store alone over the summer. Although it does just a little bit feel like one of those places you might work, and like you might work there over the summer and live in a small town, and you might like meet a cowboy and like fall in love or something. Moving on to Animus Forks, whose elevation alone made it excruciating to live there. Animus Forks is one of the highest elevation mining towns to ever exist, sitting at 11,200 feet above sea level. If you also live in the Midwest and elevation numbers mean very, very little to you, let me help you understand. 11,000 feet is 1,000 feet shy of the summit the highest point of Mount Fuji, which we all know is very tall. The air here is thin enough to be considered very dangerous for travelers, but after living in these conditions for an extended period of time, your body will adapt to the lower oxygen levels by increasing your respiratory rate and red blood cell production. Keep in mind that the people coming to and working in old AF were working 12 hours a day of hard labor. They broke ground on the first cabins in 1873, and just 3 years later in 1876, Animus Forks was a bustling community with 30 cabins, a post office, a general store, saloon, and hotels. If you're anything like me, I was a little bit confused about the hotel aspect of everything, as I was thinking, who's coming there? They don't have a lot of visitors. But the hotels were used to house miners while their houses were still being built. They even had their very own newspaper, the Animus Forks Pioneer. The high altitude brought low temperatures so unbearable that most of the town would migrate to the next town over during the winter months. There was, however, one winter where they didn't move quite fast enough, and the entire town was covered in 25 feet of snow for 23 days. Legend has it that the townspeople built tunnels in between all the cabins during this time to be able to contact each other and get supplies. The mines were rich in gold, silver, lead, copper, and zinc. And we all know how safe mining is, right? No. Mining gold causes an increased frequency of cancer in the trachea, bronchus, lung, stomach, and liver, as well as an increased risk of pulmonary tuberculosis and silicosis. Mining silver not only emits large amounts of mercury into the local waterways, but can also permanently change the color of your skin and eyes to a light blue-gray. Exposure to large amounts of lead causes things like seizures, delirium, coma, angry man syndrome, and of course, a higher risk of voting for Trump. Mining copper releases asbestos into the environment, and zinc is actually pretty safe. So, at its height, the town boasted a population of 400, which was followed by a steep decline as the mine was no longer making enough money to keep its doors open and closed in 1910. A few families stuck around, but when the post office closed in 1915, more people left, and by 1917, the entire mill was being taken apart and sold off for parts. By 1920, Animus Forks was officially a ghost town. Despite 100 years of high winds, snowfall tall enough to cover the cabin's eaves, and temperatures below -30, you can still walk inside the homes of Animus Forks and find peeling wallpaper and newspapers. Although there are federal protections for this area, its sheer altitude makes it difficult for any protection to actually be enforced by any sort of governing body, leaving the fate of these buildings in danger. However, the high elevation of this town actually helps a little bit because it's difficult to get there, right? So it's like, why would you jeep for hours or ride a horse for hours or hike for hours just to get up there and like vandalize, you know? The local community has done some preservation work and just sort of like restructuring some of the buildings, which has been super awesome. I actually visited Animus Forks when I was like 12. I was very scared. The whole thing scared me a lot. I'll try to find pictures, and if I can, I'll put them here. But I was quaking. Me and my sister were quaking. I thought ghost towns meant ghosts live there. Like the whole town, like it was built by ghosts. It was resided in by ghosts. I don't know. Scary. Moving to Capital City. Capital City, Colorado was founded in 1877 by a man named George Lee. Mr. Lee had big dreams of growing this tiny silver mining town to be the capital of Colorado, hence the name change to Capital City. He also dreamed of being the state's governor. And what is a governor without a mansion? Georgie paid to have brick hauled in from Pueblo, Colorado at the cost of $1 per brick, which is about $30 in today's money. Now you see, I'm no carpenter, and I don't know how many bricks it takes to build this here home. My limited research suggests that it takes about 10,000 bricks to build a home of this size, which would bring his grand total to $300,000 in just materials alone. The home reportedly had a generous living room, a theater with an orchestral pit, and a few guest ballrooms. When I look at this home, I think, oh, there's literally no possible way that you could fit all that in there. But that's what the records show. So, I don't know. He had money to invest, baby. And he was putting his coin towards ventures that he thought would guarantee the success of Capital City, including a sawmill, a smelter, and a lime kiln. According to an 1881 newspaper, Lee even had a field of oats. The 200-acre town had everything that it needed, from hotels to restaurants to bars, cabins, post offices, schoolhouses, you name it, they got it. The population reached 800 people at its height, but when the cost of silver dropped, so did everything else. The silver reserves were much shallower than they had originally thought, and things were over really quickly. Wannabe Governor George Lee seems to have fallen off the map. The guy doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. And historical photos of the town are slim to non-existent. Today, all that still stands is the post office and the smokestack from the smelter. Moving on to Crystal City. In 1874, Sylvester Richardson, I'm not going to be able to say it apparently. In 1874, geologist Sylvester Richardson discovered some deposits of silver in the Crystal River of Gunnison County. In the 6 years that followed, Richardson and his buddies forcibly removed the Ute people off the land so that the big fat whiteys could move in. The Ute people, whose territory had included parts of Wyoming, eastern Nevada, and Arizona, had occupied this region of Colorado since the 1500s. They fought to protect their land against invaders, but President at the time, Abraham Lincoln, required all Ute people to relocate to reservations in 1881. They used fire to clear out all the trees and brush for several acres, which permanently altered the pattern of vegetation, and we still suffer consequences of that decision into modern times. By the mid-1880s, the population reached 500, and the town included a post office, newspaper, pool hall, barber shop, saloon, and hotel, as well as an exclusive gentleman's club called the Crystal Club. But Crystal City was in an extremely remote location, with the nearest railroad being 20 miles away. The roads in and out of Crystal were really nothing more than dirt trails that really weren't even able to accommodate horses and wagons. Getting goods in and out was difficult to impossible, especially in the winter months. It was routine to not receive your mail until months and months after it was sent, and in a world where written letters are your only form of communication to the outside world, this was not gonna work. By 1889, the population was down to about 100 people, and the silver panic of 1893 was really the last nail in the coffin. What is the silver panic of 1893? Let me explain. The price of silver dropped rapidly from 83 cents an ounce to 62 cents an ounce, which caused mining companies to significantly lower workers' wages. And due to the overabundance of workers in the area, the big bosses had no problem cutting people who had an issue with that because they were so easily replaceable. The city folk in Denver panicked and began to withdraw all their money from local banks, which caused several banks to completely collapse. With no federal insurance to protect money in the banks, lots of people lost all their life savings. That same year, however, two men named George Eaton and B.S. Phillips finished building the Sheep Mountain Tunnel Mill, which supplied power to the Crystal Mine as well as a few surrounding mines. This was a hugely impressive innovation and totally seems like it could have been what Crystal City needed to keep going, but it just wasn't enough. People were starting to grow weary of mining, not just from a financial standpoint, but also from a safety standpoint as well. By 1915, there were only 8 inhabitants left, and by 1917, the town was officially vacated and the mill was closed. In summation, the native people who had occupied the land for about 380 years were forcibly removed, only for the whiteys to go in, play around for 36 years, mess up the entire ecosystem beyond repair, and then leave. Now, in 2025, the town is an outdoor paradise for climbers and four-wheeling dudes. It even serves as a summer getaway for a few people who own cabins in the area. It remains very difficult to access and requires a four-wheel drive vehicle with high clearance. Whatever that means. The land in San Juan, California was found and staked by Charles McIntyre and Albert Burroughs in 1873. They chose it for its proximity to one of our most special favoritist towns, Animus Forks, right around the corner. But one of them must have been a wee bit psychic, because not long after that, a 60-foot wide vein of quartz was found to run several miles through the new town. If you expected a quartz mine to look like this, you are not alone. So did I. However, it looks more like this, aka every other mine. Similar to Animus Forks, Mineral Point was extremely high up, extremely cold, and suffered from pretty much all the same problems. It's cold. There's always snow. You can't get mail. You can't get materials. You can't farm. Yada, yada, yada. It was pretty much just some tents kind of slapped together until 1876 when a few businesses moved in. We've got Henry and John's Minor Supply Store, Steinbach's Assay Shop, Parry's Restaurant and Saloon, and more. With all that commerce, what would you guess the population is at this point? If you said 75, you'd be correct. The town was short-lived. The ore was low quality, transportation was difficult. To demonstrate how dire the transportation system was, I bring you this article from 1899, which will be read by my partner because they do a really good old-timey voice.
Con Briggs, a mail carrier between Mineral Point and Eureka, was lost in the last storm. He left Mineral Point Thursday with the mail and was not seen since then. A number of large slides are down on the road, and it is impossible to tell where the body is, and search has been abandoned.
Despite being so close to the well-preserved town of Animus Forks, Mineral Point has not received the same treatment and is pretty much just piles of wood and this one lonely cabin. Heading to Red Mountain Town. There were a few stragglers running around Red Mountain Town in the 1870s, but it really wasn't until 1883, when silver was discovered, that all the people came pouring in. This town has a rocky history and seemed to be doomed from the beginning, with the entire city having to be moved in its first year due to the fact that they unknowingly built it on a large frozen spring, which, come summer, turned it into an uninhabitable marsh. These high elevation towns have extremely long winters, starting in about September and going till May, which I guess provides a little bit of context as to how it's even possible to make that mistake. Red Mountain Town was situated between a bunch of other small mining towns that bordered a railroad, and eventually all these towns came together to form one. But, reminiscent of the merger between Pawnee and Eagleton, this did not come without some animosity between the groups. This population was one of the highest that we've talked about thus far, peaking at about 1,000 people. Or should I say, 1,000 men. The winters here were extremely harsh, leading most sensible women and children to seek refuge at lower elevations with larger cities and more amenities. So we have 1,000 men, all from different communities with pretty significant rivalries. What could go wrong? If you guessed a serious problem with street brawling, you'd be correct. In 1892, an English preacher named William Davis decided to put an end to the violence by putting a church in town. But when he brought the idea to the city officials, they said no. They hated him. No need to cry for Davis. The next town over, Guston, accepted him with open arms and he built his church there. But the day after the church's opening, the entirety of Red Mountain Town burned to the ground. To some, this felt like an act of divine intervention, so they left. There was very limited investment in buildings and architecture here, and so this town burned down again multiple times. Red Mountain Town was greatly affected by the Silver Panic of 1893, and when they faced another huge fire in 1895, most people called it quits. By 1899, there were only a handful of people left, and not much more could be done about old RMT becoming a ghost town. Very few original structures remain at Red Mountain Town, but a few historical buildings from neighboring towns have been moved there, creating a little, collaged version of an old town. Need to be there. Take me there. I never see you at the club. Well, I never see you at Red Mountain Town, Colorado ghost town between Ouray and Silverton. The fuck? The beginnings of Goldfield date back to 1894 when James Doyle, James Burns, and John Harnan struck gold with their Portland mine, which is impossible to research given that Google thinks I am mistyping the words Portland, Maine. James and James, who proudly called themselves the Jimmies, which gives me a weird shiver down my back, affectionately called the town Gold Knob, but changed it to the more appropriate Goldfield once it gained popularity. Goldfield is completely different from pretty much any mining town that I could find, which makes me even hesitant to call it a mining town, even though that's technically what it was. These guys sought to build a true, wholesome, long-lasting community as opposed to a little ramshackle camp. Burns was put in charge of laying out the streets and selling off the plots of homes for $25 a piece, which is about $920 in today's money. Referred to as the City of Homes, Goldfield prided itself on being a family town with modern wooden sidewalks, Sunday schools, a fire department, and a town doctor who they brought on board for $300 a year, about $11,250 in today's money. They even had a pest house where they would place people who were showing signs of contagious disease. Now, what was it like to be a little girl or a little boy in an old mining town school? Well, there's not that much first-hand information out there. Little boys were permitted to begin working in the mines between ages 8 and 14, so they literally probably don't remember anything before it was dark, dank tunnels and metal inhalation. Girlies were kept at home as soon as they were able to help mom take care of the babies. Babies plural, as this time in Colorado, a family of 5 was considered very small, and a family of around 10 to 15 was much more normal. I bring you a few quotes from memoirs of teachers and students from around this time. "We all attended the stone schoolhouse on the hill. Some of the boys were good, and others not so good. One day, Mr. Hale grabbed Charles by the nape of his neck and the seat of his trousers, carried him to his desk, and gave him a good paddling, much to the amusement of the class. The schoolroom contained desks and seats of various sizes, 2 long benches, a table and chair for the teacher, a table piled high with books, and a hot blaster heater in the center of the room. I paused a few moments. I looked around the room, and I thought with a thrill, this is my very own domain for the next 8 months. All of Goldfield's officials were part of the Western Federation of Miners Union, including the town's beloved mayor, John Easter. Every dog, person, and saloon in town was required to have a license, and prostitution was severely outlawed. At the end of its first year, Goldfield was home to 2,191 residents, and by year 2, they had a dentist, an attorney, 2 chemists, 3 grocery stores, 3 doctors, and 3 saloons. By 1898, they had streetlights and telephone lines. I'm gagged. With the introduction of streetcars, they imposed a 6-mile-an-hour speed limit and a law against profanity which outlawed the word balls. It was beginning to feel like Stardew Valley's Pelican Town with the introduction of festivals, parades, and concerts. By 1900, the population rose to nearly 4,000, and the homes ranged from little beat-up cabins to gaudy homes with Victorian architecture. They had a Masonic lodge and even a trash service. But as we know, that didn't continue for long. Labor strikes bloomed in 1903, and the National Guard was called in and quartered near city limits. Striking miners were imprisoned, and it was too much for the sheltered town of Goldfield to handle. By 1904, half the homes within the city were empty, and the remaining people chose to start fresh. All of the protests and everything happened outside city limits, so I was kind of like, why are you guys so dramatic about this? Like, you guys are just kind of being wieners and losers. But I hope this news article helps you understand a little bit more just how kind of crazy it all was.
The most dastardly crime ever committed in the annals of the West Coast Line. Okay, let me start over. Something about the word dastardly.
I know.
The most dastardly crime ever committed in the annals of the West cost the lives of 13 miners, crippled many others for life, and has precipitated a condition of riot in the Cripple Creek district. They had completed their night's work, the train had whistled for the station, and was slowing to take the men aboard. Suddenly, a terrific explosion occurring under the platform of the depot tossed near...
Don't laugh. It's serious. They got exploded.
Sorry. Okay.
Well, don't start over. Keep going.
Suddenly, a terrific explosion occurring under the platform of the depot tossed nearly 1/2 of the waiting miners high into the air, mangled the bodies of 10 of them almost beyond identification. The force of the explosion put out the lights in Altman, broke windows in Goldfield, and wrecked a number of homes near the depot, and tore an immense cavern into the ground.
The population continued dropping steadily, and then even faster when the original mayor, John Easter, passed away in 1914. The entire town attended his funeral. Prohibition came and went, and by 1954, only 60 people called Goldfield home. Today, the City Hall and Firehouse still stands and is regularly upkept by the 200 or so people that still call Goldfield their summer home. This is the kind of thing that's begging for a movie or begging for a book to be written about it. I just think it's, like, fascinating. Like, that's such a... I don't know, like, the history! Right next to Goldfield lay Altman, which took a pretty different approach to pretty much everything. It was a true Wild West town full of cowboys and saloons and guns and like gay man. When labor strikes came a-knockin', Altman barricaded the entire town and announced formally that they had seceded from the country. They made catapults to hurl dynamite bombs at the deputies' camp, and eventually the state of Colorado sent in a militia to restore order. But in the end, the people of Altman won big over the greedy mine owners, earning themselves a rate of $4 per 8 hours of work, which is equivalent to about $17 an hour per day. So, like, not much has changed, having to fight brutally for a livable wage. Pretty much the only thing to do for fun in Altman was go to saloons. So all 9 saloons in town greatly enjoyed the pay raise. I bring you another news article from April 1897 that I hope further demonstrates the Wild West nature of this place.
John Cox, crazed by liquor, shot and instantly killed his partner Robert Daly in McElroy and Cole's Saloon around 10 o'clock this morning. After killing Daly, the murderer shot and missed at McElroy, shot and hit another, then passed through the door of the saloon and shot Harry Minor, breaking his arm. Then, seeing the town marshal coming down the street, shot at him. The marshal fired back, and Cox fell with a bullet in his lungs. Sorry. The longer it goes on, the more I'm losing it. Cox is an ex-convict. A few years ago, probably in 1891, he killed a man in Coal Creek and was captured by the officers in an abandoned coal mine from which he smoked out. Until recently, he boarded with Mrs. Miner, the mother of today's early victims. He and Harry Miner and Robert Daly were the best of friends and steady companions.
So he was living with that guy's mom and him.
It's crazy that he's a minor and his name is
Harry
Miner.
It's dastardly.
Mrs. Miner and Mr. Miner.
But as these things go, pretty much the entire town burned down in 1903. But not from natural causes. No, no, no. This was arson. A couple dudes in town decided to pull an insurance scam by messing with the water supply and then burning down the Altman Hotel. But being on a windy hilltop, the blaze very quickly got out of control and there was no water to fight it. 5 men were arrested for the crime, but insurance covered only $10,000 of the estimated $75,000 in damages. Glad to hear things have not changed. Founded in 1910 by Oliver Jackson, Deerfield, Colorado is different from every other town we have discussed and will discuss in this video. Deerfield was not a mining town at all. It was a very slow-growing, homesteading, majority black village. Jackson was heavily inspired by Booker T. Washington and sought to foster middle-class self-sufficiency for the black community on the Eastern Plains. The original plan was to eventually expand the camp to include a sanatorium, as most other similar facilities at the time did not allow black patients. But unfortunately, the first several seasons were extremely harsh, and they really weren't able to farm much at all. They were attempting to grow strawberries, cantaloupe, and melon, all of which require a lot of water, but they did have chickens, geese, horses, and cattle, which proved to be easier to maintain. In 1915, Deerfield was home to 300 residents and 44 cabins. Then came World War I, but don't fret, it actually slayed for the residents of Deerfield. Demand for their agricultural products boomed, and they made $50,000 in 1918, equivalent to about $755,000 today, which allowed them to get new farm equipment, upgrade their stock, and make necessary home improvements. They even had enough left over to put in a cannery and soap factory. There were annual festivals and carnivals, a thriving baseball league, dance halls, and integrated schools, but the prosperity was unfortunately short-lived. The 1930s brought along 2 little things you might know pretty well: the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. And I don't know if I really fully grasped this when we learned about the Dust Bowl in 5th or 6th grade, but the Dust Bowl lasted for 6 years. 6 years of complete drought, not being able to grow anything, absolutely no rain, and dust flying literally everywhere. At the time, a lot of people felt the dust storms were an act of God, but the reality has a more user error feeling to it. People all throughout Kansas and Colorado were plowing the land like no tomorrow and ridding the plains of the natural tall grasses that kept all the dirt where it was supposed to be. That, coupled with severe drought, made the land inhospitable and people rapidly cleared out. Jackson couldn't let it go. He tried marketing the area as a popular tourist destination, but when that didn't work, he started selling off the abandoned homes, and when the abandoned homes got overtaken by grass, he tried a less awesome thing to try and save it. No! Jackson did offer to sell Deerfield to the US government to be turned into a Japanese-American internment camp. It didn't work though, so that's good. In his old age, Jackson continued recruiting and searching for a young black man who could champion the rebuilding of Deerfield. After a while, it was only Jackson, his wife, and another man who believed in the mission. Jackson died in 1948 at the age of 86, but the last remaining resident stayed until the 1970s when he passed away. Jackson's family home is one of the only buildings still standing, and there has been much work from the local community to preserve the land, but it continues to crumble and it most likely won't be around for much longer. My sister would not let me finish this video without talking about her favorite ghost town, Tomboy. Favorite not for its views or mining prowess, but rather for a book she was obsessed with as a 10-year-old, Tomboy Bride. Tomboy Bride is a book of diary entries by Harriet Fish Backus that detail what it was like to be a woman living in a mining camp. Trying to find information on this book was like pulling teeth, which was hilarious to me considering how big a part of my childhood this book was. The way that my sister and I thought about it and talked about it, I thought that everybody knew about this. I thought this queen was famous. Newsflash, Queen doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Harriet, born in 1885, was a teacher from the San Francisco Bay Area who, after marrying her high school sweetheart George Backus in 1908, moved to the small mining town outside Telluride, Colorado. A few of the sources that I read said that Harriet was born in 1899, which would make her 9 years old when her and George got married. And the way that I was like, oh, okay, different times. Thankfully, those were wrong. And they were wed at the very appropriate age of 23. Georgie boy got a job working in a mine 11,000 feet above sea level where it regularly snowed 20 feet, which I'm sure Harriet was thrilled by. Harriet stated that George told her nothing but to, quote, pack her warmest clothes and buy a high-altitude cookbook, which a lot of people seem to think is very charming, but I think I would have killed that man, because what came next was a 3,000-foot sleigh ride on a narrow trail pulled by 2 horses who were so exhausted that they were slipping everywhere, only to arrive at the top and see the 2-room shack that they would be living in. She describes moments of happiness alongside deep isolation and enduring long periods of hunger. Although they weren't allowed in the mines themselves, women in mining camps were put to work, honey. They were cooks, launderers, and assisted in clerical work, water hauling, and bathing, on top of being expected to raise children. Long exposure to high altitude during pregnancy causes a whole bunch of issues, and giving birth at that high altitude poses even more risks. Thankfully, Georgie was on top of that, and he rented Harriet a room at a lower elevation hotel so that she would be able to give birth there. But they still had to go back up the mountain with a newborn. So I don't know how many brownie points he actually gets. Speaking about her newborn baby Hattie, she says, "Dear little Harriet, completely hidden in blankets. How did she get air to breathe? What would I do when her diaper needed changing, or when she must be nursed?" George wasn't just your average miner. He was a college-educated engineer, so he was doing more sciencey pursuits and had a better quality of life than pretty much all of his coworkers and Harriet up on the mountain. Harriet gave up her career as a teacher to raise his children while traveling from mine to mine just to pack up and leave again. Georgie eventually landed a job back in California that he kept for 37 years, and the stability allowed Harriet to put together this lovely book. Really, I'm just hating on George because, just like men in general. But from all accounts, it really did seem like Harriet loved him a lot and felt like everything, all these hardships were worth it so long as they were together. But I am always extremely cautious to claim that women in these times were actually fulfilled or happy, considering that their options were extremely limited and controlled completely by the men in their lives. Or you could just say that I am an angry feminist, because that works too. Lastly, I won't bore you with the story of Ironton because it's not that interesting, but I did need you to see this picture. There is a stunning amount of pictures from Ironton, like somebody in town was a photographer. But this shop is called I Steal and Beware. Plain sewing and pawnbrokers. And it really tickled me. Colorado's ghost towns, of course, allow us to step into the shoes of historical figures and kind of see what it was like to live back then. But aside from that, abandoned places are a lesson in overreach and planning failures, as well as a crucial look into the human hubris. It showcases perfectly what overconfidence, arrogance, and entitlement gets us. These short-lived towns have left us with over a century of environmental ruin. We continue to see land degradation from resource extraction and waterways so polluted that they will never again sustain life. They show us that life moves on without us, and that we need to think about that. Or maybe that huge corporations need to think about that. Are ghost towns worth preserving? Sure. The allure of ghost towns is undeniable, and they serve as a great place for sustainable tourism. Sustainable as long as everyone's following the rules. Moral of the story is, if you get a letter, a handwritten letter from old Jim Bobby, he tells you that he's been hearing some whisperings on the wind of a new place opening up out west. Somewhere where you can work a whole day and make a whole $5. He tells you, bring the wife, bring the kids. You can even bring that old mutt y'all love so much. He says, we're going to set up shop. We're going to build a new America. You run the other way.